Good morning again, brothers and sisters at Grace Bible Chapel. I do miss you all. I wish that we could meet together in person. I would love to see each of your smiling faces this morning, but I do hope that this will be an encouragement to you. I'm going to continue on with a series that I began before the pandemic, just going through the Gospel of Mark. And through my notes and see that we're halfway through the second chapter. And we're going to look at three stories that where Jesus addresses uh, these three groups. He's given a question by the people, and he's questioned by the Pharisees twice, and it has to do with the law and with the new way that Jesus is bringing things about. And so, let's just take a look at chapter 2. We're going to dig in at verse 18. And just the first point that I want to make, and I'm going to sort of separate these out into 3 points. And the first point is this: that religious commitment is not the same as genuine faith. And so let's look at this story here. It says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and the people came and said to him, 'Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' And Jesus said to them, 'Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in that day. And no one sews pieces of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts a new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins.'" So here we see Jesus, and this is this point that I think he's making here about religious commitment. The Pharisees and the disciples of the Pharisees, and also the disciples of John the Baptist, they fasted. And here we have Jesus' disciples, and they're not. And the people, they notice this. This is obviously something that is out there. That's something that people can see, and they notice it. And so they question Jesus. They're like, "Why is this different? Why don't your disciples fast? Isn't that a religious practice? If you're a good Jew, that's something that you should be doing, especially, if you're following a teacher, a rabbi, a Pharisee, or John the Baptist. Well, why aren't you fasting? That's what you should be doing." And Jesus tells them this story about the bridegroom. Now, from our perspective, we might not quite understand uh, what this means, but it was actually in those days, if you were invited to a wedding and you were friends of the bridegroom and the bridegroom is there and part of the whole wedding ceremony, one of the things you could not be doing in order to come to the wedding is to fast. You cannot come to the wedding with the feast there and say, "Oh, I'm not going to partake because I'm fasting right now." That wasn't allowed. And Jesus even says that. He says, the guest cannot fast when the bridegroom is there. And he's referring to himself as the bridegroom. And so while he is there, his disciples, they won't be fasting. He says there's going to be a time when the bridegroom is taken away, and then they will fast. But for now, that's not what they're doing. And then Jesus tells these two parables, these two short stories. And again, for us, these two examples, analogies, maybe they don't quite have the same impact that they would in the first century. Unshrunk cloth. We can kind of understand that if you take cloth that's unshrunk and you sew it as a patch onto clothes that are older that have already been shrunk, that if you wash it, there's a likelihood that new cloth, when it shrinks, is going to tear away from the old. Well, that was very much the case in the first century, because unshrunk cloth, even that Greek word that is translated as unshrunk cloth, it's cloth that had not been treated by the fuller. A fuller, that was a job, it was the practice where they would take the natural fibers of the cloth, and when it's put together, they would comb it and wash it and bleach it and pre-shrink it so that it would be ready to be used to make clothes out of, or to make patches for clothes. And so this unshrunk cloth, this word for that is cloth that had not been treated by the fuller yet. And everybody there would have known that this is true, that this is the case. The same goes for this analogy of the wineskins. And wineskins are leather. When it's fresh leather, it's pliable, it's malleable, it can expand and contract. It's got some flexibility to it. As the leather gets older, the wineskins would get older. They would become brittle, and they're hard. Now, in the process of fermenting wine, they would begin by putting them into vats, and during the last part of the process, they would put the wine into new wineskins. And that last bit of fermentation would expand the wineskins, but they would be able to handle it. Now, if you were to pour that not quite ready yet wine into old wineskins, the brittle leather, it would burst. As that last stage of fermentation would happen, it would ruin the wineskins, and the wine itself would be ruined. And again, this would be something that would be common knowledge at that time, and they would know and understand this. And so here Jesus is making this reference to the new and the old. The old way of thinking, the old way of doing things, the old way of the Pharisees. It was very much this, here is the law and we keep the law. And the law is most important, and we will keep our rules. And by keeping our rules, we are more righteous. By being more committed to this religious practice, we are more righteous than the people around us. And this was the standard at which they held themselves higher. I mean, the Bible would tell us that they would tithe a tenth of even like the mint and spices that they would get. They would tithe right down even that, give a tenth of their sugar and a tenth of their salt and their mint and whatever spices they would have, so that they could say, I have kept to the letter of the law. And Jesus is saying, he's giving this illustration saying that is the old way. And there is something new that he is bringing. And that something new, again, it's fellowship. It's the kinship of God that he is offering. He's that relationship, as guests of the bridegroom. Who are the guests of the bridegroom? Well, they would be his friends. They would be those who he cares about, those who you invite to your wedding, or the people who you're close to. And so we get this idea of this old way of just keeping the rules, and the new way of fellowship with God. And so you see this first point that I want to make, that religious commitment or religious practice, it's not the same as genuine faith. Let's look at the second story here. And here we have what the Pharisees have now gotten into the game. They're now contending with Christ over something that they witness. And here the second point that I want to make, and the second point that the Lord makes here, he makes this amazing statement about the Sabbath, but it's just this, that the law is made for man, not man for the law. So let's take a look at this story, looking at verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God, and at the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So again, here let's set the stage of what this story means here, to give us an idea of what the disciples are doing. They're gleaning from the fields. Now, this was a practice that was actually put in place by the law. If you owned a field and you grew grain or whatever it is that you grew, when harvest time would come, you wouldn't harvest all the way to the edges. You would leave the edges for the poor and those who didn't have a field of their own to grow food or couldn't afford to buy food. And they would come for the day and they would collect food for the day from what was left at the edges. They would have to come and pick it themselves so that they could sustain themselves. And so here, this is what the disciples are doing. This is not unlawful what they're doing. They're not stealing from people. They're pulling the heads of grain off of the wheat. Now, if you've ever done that before, you'll know that wheat, the actual grain, has a husk on it. In order to get the grain underneath to eat, you would have to rub it between your hands. That's why when it talks about the threshing floor, to thresh the wheat, when they would throw it up in the air and let it and grind it down, it was to get rid of that husk. And so this is really what the disciples are doing, just with their hands. They're rubbing it together. Now, in the idea of the Pharisees, they looked at that and said, ha, it's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and that's work. Now, I don't think any of us would look at that practice and say, boy, that guy's really working hard as he's rubbing grain between his fingers. And so what the Pharisees have done over time is they've taken the law and they've built a wall of external rules around the law, rules that they themselves had come up with, rules about washing hands, rules about washing cups, rules about what is work and what is not work. Nothing that was actually written in the law itself, but things that they have added to it. And it would give them a bigger and bigger checklist to use to say, look, I have done all these things. You have not. I'm more righteous than you. And so here Jesus, he hits them head on with this when they come and they say, hey, how come they're not doing what's lawful? It's not lawful to do work on the Sabbath. And so Jesus tells them, brings them back to the story. And I love the way that he says this, because he just hits them right between the eyes with that very first statement. Have you never read what David did? Have you never read? Let's understand one thing. They've read. They absolutely have read. They've probably read it multiple times. These guys are the Pharisees. They're the ones who studied the law. They were experts in it. They had read all of the passages of what David did. This would be like asking like a nuclear physicist, like, don't you know physics? Or asking LeBron James, don't you know how to play basketball? This is almost a ridiculous statement to make, but Jesus makes the point here. He says, have you never read this story? And he tells them the story of David when he's fleeing from Saul. And him and his men, they're hungry and they're in need. And he comes to the tabernacle and he asks for the bread of the presence to sustain them. And he eats it and he gives it to those who are with him. And that's against the law. It's not lawful. It's only the priests that are supposed to eat that. And here Jesus says, look, this is what he did. Do you not understand that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath? And you see what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, you guys are experts in the law. Like, you've read this, you know this stuff, but you have no clue what it actually means. You see, they had completely missed the point. And sometimes maybe we do too. Do you understand, brothers and sisters, that the law is made for your good and for mine? I mean, we look at the 10 Commandments. Look at what they are. Look at everything that's in there. That's for our good. When Jesus was asked to what was the greatest commandment, he sums up the law in 2 points. He says this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And this is the point. What was the Sabbath for? What was the purpose of the Sabbath? If we were to go back into the Old Testament and look at it, it was a day that was to be set aside where the people were not to work. They weren't to try and grow crops or do whatever their daily tasks and chores were. They were to set that day aside to remember the Lord and to remember what God had done for them when he led them out of Egypt, out of slavery and bondage. How important is this? Well, how often did the people forget? How often did the people forget the Lord? Do they forget the goodness of what he'd done? And they wander off and worship other gods. It was for their good. That was the purpose of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. not man, for the Sabbath. And the Pharisees had put so many restrictions. Even today, there's so many of those restrictions. Even today, if you're a practicing Jew, if you were in Israel and you were to keep the Sabbath, the Shabbat laws, here's some of the things that you would not be able to do on the Sabbath. Things that are not allowed on Shabbat: writing, erasing, and tearing, business transactions, driving or riding in cars or other vehicles, shopping, using the telephone, turning on or off anything which uses electricity, including lights, radios, televisions, computers, air conditioners, and alarm clocks, cooking, baking, or kindling a fire, gardening and grass mowing, doing laundry. You can't even turn a light switch on. I know some of you have been to Israel before. I know maybe you've experienced this firsthand, but in Israel, if you're staying in a hotel that stays true to the Shabbat, this keeps the Sabbath, each of the elevators have a Sabbath mode that they go into, where it will stop and open the doors at every single floor. Because by pressing the button to say, I want to go to the ground floor, you're completing an electrical circuit, and that's considered work. You think of how oppressive that can be. If you haven't prepared ahead of time, if you haven't cooked your meals ahead of time and lit the fire in the fireplace and turned all the lights on in your house, if you keep the Sabbath, you may spend the day in the dark, cold, and hungry. That's not what the Sabbath was meant to be. It was meant to be set aside as a day to remember the Lord. And it's for our good. Let's look at our third story here. And this is our last point. And this speaks so much to the heart of things. Jesus asked this question to the Pharisees about the Sabbath. He says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? So let's read the story. Chapter 3, verse 1. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So this is the last point. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? Do we do good or we do harm? Here we have the Pharisees, and they're bad actors in this. Their desire is to catch the Lord in something, to discredit him, to destroy him. And they know that this man with the withered hand is there, and they're just waiting. They want Jesus to heal him so that they can accuse him and run his name through the mud for working on the Sabbath. I guess they considered healing a man working. And Jesus knows this. And so he asks them this question, to which they are silent in response. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, or to do harm, to save life or to kill? They didn't respond. How could they respond? They couldn't accuse him after this. And he's grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he's angered at them with this, their attitude. They didn't care about this man. They didn't care about his well-being, about his hand. All they wanted to do was catch the Lord Jesus in something. They wanted to discredit him. They liked the old way. They liked the way things were. It kept them in power. It was a way where they could puff themselves up and say, I'm more righteous than you. They didn't want anything new. And so Jesus heals the man. He restores his hand. Like this idea of a withered hand, it probably was malformed in some way, probably hadn't grown properly. It was completely useless to the man. And Jesus doesn't just heal it, he restores it completely, fully functioning. But an incredible miracle. And how do the Pharisees respond to this incredible miracle? They seek to destroy him. And this is the point that I want to make. And this I think is what the lesson is for us, because we can look sometimes at the Pharisees and we can say, oh, those self-righteous people. We can be the same if we're honest. It didn't take the Christian church very long before they started adopting traditions and rules and liturgy and all the trappings of an organized church. It took a few hundred years after Pentecost before all the same kind of ritual was added again back into the church. And even that word church, we have a tendency to think of that as a place or a building or an institution. That word, it really just means a gathering of people. It's a congregation. And that's what we are as the church. We're not a place, we're not an institution, we're a gathering of people. But how soon did all these traditions get tacked on again? And, we can go from we have so many different denominations, don't we, within the evangelical church. And each one of us thinks we're right, don't we? I think we've got the right way of doing church. And that can be such a trap. It can be such a trap. We can get caught in this idea, that we're the ones who are right. We love being right, don't we? We all do. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Maybe it's just me, but it just seems to me when you meet somebody who doesn't like a food that you love, you just feel an immediate need to try and convince them that they're wrong and that this is actually a delicious food that they should love, because we kind of like being right. When I was growing up, we would always, when we'd have birthday cake, we would always put it in a bowl and we'd pour milk on it. And that's how we would eat it, like milk and cookies, but milk and cake. I loved that growing up. When I shared that way of eating cake with the Carr family, they disagreed. They think it's gross, but I love it. And what did I want to do? I want to convince them that, this is the best way to eat cake. And of course, they want to convince me that that's a terrible way to eat cake, because we just like to be right, don't we? And sometimes we can get caught in that with our own traditional ways of doing church, and we just want to be right. And sometimes the danger is to elevate the traditions, the way of doing church that cannot be backed up by Scripture, but is just something that we have the freedom to do because of the grace of God. And we elevate it up to being at the same level as doctrine. And it gives us a little high and mighty feeling, a way of looking down at other people who do things differently and saying, well, I'm right and you're wrong. See, I've got these boxes checked, and that makes me more righteous than you. And that's just the attitude of the Pharisees. And that's the old way. That's the old wineskins. That's the old unshrunk cloth. Or that's the unshrunk cloth. That is the attitude that grieved the Lord Jesus, hardened his heart. And so even as we look at our traditions, the way that we do church, and we look at the practices that we do, and sometimes it's just because that's the way we like to do it, and we're familiar with it, and we like it, and it's good. There's nothing wrong with it. But we do need to ask ourselves, are we doing good or are we doing harm? Because sometimes holding on to tradition can do more harm than good. Sometimes when our attitude is that we're better than other people because of we hold to this particular tradition. And sometimes we can be guilty of using it as a club, can't we? and it does more harm, and it doesn't do good. And sometimes there's things we can change that'll do good. And that really needs to be the question that we ask, don't we? And Jesus here, I mean, he's addressing the attitude of heart, isn't it? That's what grieves him. It grieves him at the hardness of their heart. It grieves him that they're so stuck in what they think is right, that they're not listening to the one who is the Lord of the Sabbath, to the one who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the one who instituted the law, the one who knows what it's all about. And they're stuck in their own ways. So I want to challenge you with that this morning. I hope this is an encouragement to you. You know, I do miss you all. I wish you all the best. I look forward to the day when we can get together again as a congregation of fellowship. But I just pray that you'd have a good day today, and God bless.